Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the fan film, the short film, The Spider. So, regardless of my opinion of this movie, firstly, I'm going to say there's going to be a link down in the description to be able to see The Spider, the 9-minute fan film, short film that is to exist on YouTube. For those of you that aren't completely aware of this whatsoever, or are to have heard about it through the grapevine, but then we're like, okay, but what is this going to be? Because what is a fan film or short film? Is that going to get released on Netflix or Hulu or whatever? Because even if there was really a lot of buzz created about this whole spider thing, really, I was like, okay, but what does that mean? That's really what I was thinking. So, uh, really, I have to go on and I have to state that I know that this entire short film is 9 minutes in length, and I am probably going to be talking more than 9 minutes about my thoughts about this thing. So, really, I have to state that first, I love the fact that this is a love letter to the Spider-Man films. I say Spider-Man films, but it mostly feels like the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie to me. But anybody who is to go on and also to have watched said fan film would probably say it's like, oh no, it feels like all of them. All right, like great, like sure. Um, but to me, it probably feels like the Tobey Maguire franchise if you also take the Gwen Stacy scene in this film. But anyways, so I love that it's the love letter. But then I also have to go on and say that parodying or spoofing or putting a Spider-Man esque like character in a horror genre is not exactly breaking brand new ground. And I have to go on and now take a lot of comparisons to this Spider film, regardless of length, regardless of it's a spider character, and so on and so forth, and whatever, what have you. So, with that said, and any of the comparisons I'm going to make isn't saying that every single one of these things are all better than this, because everyone has their chance to be able to make a movie regardless of length. Everyone can have their chance to be able to make something. And I really feel that regardless of what I have to say, this movie was quasi creative, because when watching this thing, I was like, man, like, what could you do with like all the other characters that exist in the comic book world? Like, man, if you could just take a Ghost Rider character and make him work for the devil, or just kind of have him like be his own boss of what he's gonna do. Take good people and put them down to hell, and take the bad people and bring them to heaven, and really just kind of make Green Goblin. What if you made him a good guy? Ooh, and so on and so forth. There were so many things like kind of like churning in my brain of what all you could do with all of these characters that have ever existed in comic book world. What if you made Batman a bad character? Maybe you make him a vampire. Oh, whatever. But anyways, so uh, with that said, let's go on and let's do the comparisons that I have to forcibly do because I love comparisons. So, and I'm also going to bring up some movies that people are aware of and some stuff that people are not even aware of at all. Because I know when hearing these things, I'm like, what? But they exist, believe me. So, firstly, comparisons to Spider-Man spoof films. Firstly, we would have to say superhero movie would be the main character being a dragonfly, but his story is somewhat similar to a Peter Parker-esque like character. Not saying that superhero movie is going to be better than the Spider, just saying that here is a Peter Parker Spider-Man character put into a somewhat similar Spider-Man world, but then goes off into doing something completely different as far as a hourglass villain, and eventually having like its character being tied to like Xavier and all kinds of weird goofy stuff in that film, which fun movie. Then of course we have another spoof that is not have to do with a Spider-Man like character per se, but bear with me here. We also have another movie called Spaghetti Man, which instead of a web swinging man, we have a character who is to be swinging by spaghetti noodles and is to noodle up his villain characters. And really, I would go on and say that that's kind of goofy, fun, low budgetish kind of Spider-Man parody that regardless of how it eventually ends, with who we find out who the villain is, that movie is also just kind of to need to be compared to the Spider. Then, of course, we have to also talk about the Spider-Man-ish characters that are to be in a horror genre, which again, not breaking any new ground. We of course have to first talk about Madam Web. And Madam Web is technically Spider-Man adjacent characters that are going into a mostly horror genre, which in that movie there's no real spandex or tights being really put into that movie beyond certain seconds. But it's to be Spider-Man adjacent characters being put in a horror genre, and it's not a good film. But I enjoyed it regardless. But so, then we get to the last movie, which is to really be the biggest comparison beyond other just superhero movies that I could just talk about here, like The Unhealer, which is at first to be kind of a hero character, but then he kind of turns villain. Brightburn, which is to be more of a like a Superman comparison character that really is to be probably the closest comparison that probably a number of people will make with this thing. But then lastly, I of course had gone on to see this movie late at night years ago and probably not had seen the whole movie and wanted to actually rewatch the film after seeing this film because it's severely similar, with the exception of we have a Peter Parker Spider-Man character that is to be put in a completely different world, and that of course is to be the Dan Aykroyd Pedro Pascal movie Earth versus the Spider, which I was kind of curious if that is the reasoning why they had this movie called The Spider, is maybe because of that film, or maybe it's just a coinky dink. Don't know. But so, really, when going to have to compare that final movie to The Spider, I'm like, well, Earth versus the Spider is actually just better. It really just is in my eyes, because it's a Peter Parker Spider-Man character that is to have its own story. Whereas this Peter Parker Spider-Man character is to have a severely similar story to a thing that already exists. And so, not to say that like these two things can't exist, but I'm just gonna watch Earth versus the Spider a lot more after this. When I have to go on and have to forcibly get it on eBay via a DVD purchase because it doesn't exist anywhere for me to say that you can watch it, sadly enough, beyond a eBay DVD purchase, because it's not even available on Amazon. So So yeah, so with that said, let's go on and let's get into spoilers so I can kind of quickly wrap this movie up. Because again, I've already talked for this movie beyond its actual runtime. But I have to do spoilers anyways because I have to do the normal way of breaking down these movies and talk about how I want to talk about it. So let's get into spoilers. So firstly, of course, in the beginning of the film, we would have our Peter Parker character making its way into a laboratory where we then get the spider bite. We really could have gone on and actually broken down how the spider is to come into fray and be maybe wildly different than any of the other Spider-Man kind of stories, but we just have Spider coming in, conk, and Peter eventually becomes the uh the superpowered character he is to become in this story. So we have the spider bite, and immediately after the lab, it seems that Peter is to be feeling fairly ill, and so he is to kind of black out in a neighborhood somewhere. And it seems that we are to find two people who are to want to either wake this person up or mug him, steal his wallet. Because, of course, this is to be the setting of New York. So we would come to have this mugger who is to try to grab the spider's wallet to then have our spider character latch on to this person's hand to then rip off the skin of this person's hand. I'm like, all right, like this is a way that we can go into a horror direction of this character, but then also like you would have to think of like Amazing Spider-Man when uh we would come to find Andrew Garfield in the subway, and he is to be latching on to certain characters and completely rip off their clothing because he is just kind of stuck to them. So I'm like, oh my god, like, what would you do with skin in that situation? Just rip off the skin. And I'm like, all right, like, you'd have to realize that this spider powered character is just so strong that he can just rip skin off of people's hands. I'm like, all right, this is a very good way to start this. So moving on. So we then would have our character that is to start to realize that he is to be a strong character. That, of course, we would have the wall crawling things happening with, of course, our character latching his hand onto this wall, but then realize he's like, well, like, I can put my foot here and my other foot here and just, like, create a thumbnail for somebody in the future. Because that, of course, is going to be the thumbnail that I'm going to use, hopefully. But yeah, but that scene was like the coolest scene of this whole entire movie, and I was wondering, like, man, I hope that they just use glue for all that, where he's just kind of glued to the wall instead of them just doing this line or this rope like thing, just kind of keeping him there. That probably would have been the much safer route, but I'm hoping that it was just one of those where it's like they just kind of glued him to the wall and he just stuck there and scene happened. So we would then find our character who is just crawling on these walls and these locales and whichever. Which again, I was kind of curious of how exactly they approached all that with either glue or just really going on and making set pieces that kind of looked uh, uh, like walls, but then kind of adjusting for a character to be able to crawl upon them. Right after that, we would, of course, then have our character also realizing that it can jump really high, or I'm assuming web swing. And we would have our character woohooing after that. Like, I don't know if he jumped or if there was a web swing, like, but like I didn't really see enough like web shooting in this film. So like I was really just like, okay, like was that a jump there? Or I don't know. Um but then so after that, like the happiness of all of that is to happen with our character to find him to come back home to then realize that he's like, well, you know what, I'm kind of feeling ill, I'm kind of feeling sick. What's going on with my bate? And then of course we would come to find our character now becoming a man spider, which of course would have to be compared to the comic books. But then also, here's where we start to get to the part where I have to compare this a lot more to either Jeff Goldblum, The Fly, or compare this to the, of course, Earth versus the Spider, because makeup via these two movies are drastically different, and probably I would go with more of the Earth versus Spider makeup via this one because reasons. But anyways, I'm sorry for having to compare these two movies because really it's a drastically different budget. It's a drastically different amount of time being spent on a film and everything. And all these people who had worked on the Spider worked really hard. And me having to compare a $2 million movie to X number of money movie is just like, why? But then again, I'm also talking way longer than this whole entire length of the film. So why do that also? But anyways, we have our character starting to become the man spider, and he is to go on and start losing teeth, and he is to pass out or fall asleep in one of his classes to then have Gwen Stacy try and wake him up, and he is to have either snot, webbing, or drool upon his face, like all of them combined together, just goopity goo, just flying out of the dude's mouth, and goopity goo, just the weirdest of things. But again, man, I'm thinking of like, besides all the goo and the ugh, I'm thinking of like, man, you could do an evil Ghost Rider, an evil Green Goblin, or a good Green Goblin, or you could do all these other characters. Like I'm thinking all the possibilities. Because man, wouldn't that be fun? Instead of thinking what's going on in this film, because that's what I did with Brightburn, is do the exact same thing. But so we have our character who is at school and he is drooling and snotting and webbing all throughout his mouth, and he is to find his way into an ambulance because his health has deteriorated so badly, to then wake up upon this ambulance to find that he is to have attached himself to hair and clothing and so many, of course, things, because this character cannot go on to control its abilities yet and perfect it. And so, also unconsciously, how could you control those powers? Also, very clever for the writing of this to do that as well. So, we then turn around and have our character who feels that he cannot just go to the hospital and cure this all away, and he also wants to keep these powers as well. So, we come to find our Peter Parker running off. And yes, he is to, of course, be called Peter or Parker in this film, to not say that, oh, he's not exactly Peter Parker, but Peter Parker adjacent. So, we have our character running home to then have his aunt kind of banging on the door, like, hey, Peter, are you okay? To really forcefully want our Peter Parker to be left alone. Well, of course, he is to be gaining his man spider teeth and all kinds of other goofingly weird makeup. And so we then have this all come to a head to force our Ben Parker character, after he is to hear the screams, the cries of Peter, because he is really just turning into a big, huge rage monster. We go on to have our Ben Parker needing to go on and knock on the door to Peter, giving him the whole, like, a great power, great responsibility speech without really giving it again. It's like, well, hey, like, Peter, remember what we talked about? Great responsibility. Which I thought was like a cool nod. I'm like, we're still getting, even in a Peter Parker's Spider-Man spin-off or parody thing, we're still getting the great power, great responsibility thing. And I thought that was hilarious. But so Ben Parker's like, hey, I gotta come in, I gotta see what's wrong with Peter, because I think he's gonna be a rage monster. So Ben checks in on Peter to find that he is going to be killed. So of course Ben Parker is going to get killed. And Aunt May makes his way, or makes his way. Aunt May makes her way into the room as well, to find that Ben Parker is dead, and then the movie ends. So we don't know if this man spiderish character is going to be a killing spree character that kills multiple people, or if Ben was just the one who had gotten killed by mistake. And that kind of sucks. What if he was just a mistaken death? Like, that would have been more interesting of the story, to just realize that, like, the spider accidentally kills people and doesn't do it on purpose. Or maybe Ben just got scared of Peter and then knocked himself out and died. There could be a number of ways we could write this story. But so we come to really have me say at the end of all this that, like, there's also a number of what if comic books that really I do not know if there ever is a Spider-Man that kills. Like, there probably could be a what if comic book that I'm not thinking of that does have that, but there are, of course, what if comic book Spider-Man things that are to be like, what if Aunt May died instead of Ben Parker? Or what if Spider-Man was a completely different person altogether? I think Flash Thompson was to be Spider-Man. And I'm sure a number of other what if comic books that eventually became a story that they went with in a number of shows and movies and whatever. But so, with that said, like, Spider-Man becoming one of the Fantastic Four members, boom, like that happened in the comic books. So, with that said, if it seems that the Spider story is doing so well, then maybe at some point there is going to be a real story where our Spider-Man is going to become full-on villain, besides possibly Superior Spider-Man, where it was technically Doc Ock, but then Doc Ock started to like shift and change. It's like, okay, like, I may go on and do some underhanded things, but like, I'm going to do it for the greater good. And so, yeah, you could say that that is a Spider-Man that does technically kill, but that's not a Peter Parker Spider-Man that kills. That's a Doc Ock in a Peter Parker body being Spider-Man and killing. So, yeah, like, that's not exactly a Peter Parker character that kills. So with that said, and then also I haven't read up on all the newer like Chasms and Ben Reilly characters, which are all also pretty cool. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here because I've been talking for way too long, and I realized that this was gonna be like a video that was gonna take a million years for me to go on into everything. But I needed to get everything out there because that's how I do things. And I don't care how long of a video or movie or show or whatever it is, I'm just going to keep talking regardless. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.